October 27, 1942. Just after sunrise in the South Pacific, roughly 420 miles northeast of Guadalcanal, Commander Edward P. Parker stood at the rail of the heavy cruiser USS Northampton, staring across the smoke-choked sea. What remained of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet was sinking steadily, its shattered hull glowing from internal fires that had burned through the night. As the carrier finally slipped beneath the surface, she took with her 140 sailors and the last fully active American fleet carrier still fighting in the Pacific. The light from the burning fuel spread across the water in wide, flickering sheets, making the ocean appear as though it had become a vast, trembling pool of fire. In that surreal glow, Parker scribbled a private note in his logbook, a bleak assessment that, if read by the wrong officer, might have ended his career. 4 fleet carriers in less than a year. If this continues, we may run out entirely before the year ends. The list was grim. USS Lexington had gone down at the Coral Sea on May 8th. USS Yorktown was lost at Midway on June 7th. USS Wasp was torpedoed in September near Guadalcanal. And now, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, USS Hornet had joined them. In only 10 months of fighting, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once portrayed in American briefings as an imitator incapable of original design, had eliminated more than half of the United States Pacific carrier strength. While American ships were disappearing beneath the waves, Japanese shipyards from Yokosuka to Kure were working continuously, assembling new carriers to replace their own losses and expand their striking power. Yet, on the opposite side of the world, roughly 3,700 miles away in Newport News, Virginia, a welder named Margaret Thompson was preparing to start another night shift. Her work, and the work of thousands like her, would soon contradict every fear Commander Parker wrote down that morning. Neither she nor Parker could have known that the moment he witnessed as a near-total collapse of American naval aviation would soon mark a turning point, the opening chapter of one of the most extraordinary industrial surges in modern history. The coming transformation would not hinge on a single admiral's strategy or a new technological breakthrough. Instead, it would arise from something far more expansive: the overwhelming mobilization of a democratic nation that had finally committed its full industrial strength to the war. Machine shops, factories, and shipyards would be reorganized at unprecedented speed. Housewives stepped into welding booths, young men from rural towns became shipfitters, and entire communities reshaped their daily lives around wartime production. Japanese officers would later describe the result as facing an enemy whose ships seemed to multiply endlessly. Like fighting the stars, one survivor recalled. No matter how many American carriers were sunk, more arrived to take their place. Within just 3 years, U.S. shipyards, driven by a vast network of laborers, engineers, and assembly line innovation, would launch 14 Essex-class fleet carriers that actually reached combat, a number surpassing Japan's total wartime carrier construction. This surge reshaped the Pacific War and permanently altered naval warfare. The crisis of 1942, which had seemed to signal the collapse of American carrier power, instead triggered a production effort unmatched in scale or speed. It demonstrated what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had feared most. Once fully mobilized, the United States could pour out ships, aircraft, and materiel in quantities no other nation could hope to equal. It was an industrial response that rewrote the balance of power in the Pacific and redefined the mathematics of modern warfare. The chain of American carrier losses in the early Pacific War began on May 8, 1942, in the Coral Sea. On that day, the USS Lexington, one of only 2 large U.S. carriers built on converted battlecruiser hulls before the war, was struck hard during repeated Japanese air assaults. 2 torpedoes slammed into her side, followed by 3 high-explosive bombs dropped by carrier-based aircraft. Her crew fought stubbornly to contain the fires and initially appeared to have the situation under control. But gasoline fumes leaking from shattered aviation fuel tanks ignited a series of devastating internal explosions. Within hours, the ship was doomed. The Lady Lex sank beneath the waves, taking 216 sailors with her, the first American fleet carrier lost in the conflict.
Her captain, Frederick Sherman, later recounted the broader implications before Congress. At the war's opening, he noted, the United States had only 7 fleet carriers available in the Pacific, while Japan commanded 10. Every senior naval officer understood the harsh arithmetic. The U.S. Navy could not afford losses at a 1-to-1 rate, and certainly not faster. A second major loss followed scarcely a month later. On June 7, 1942, the USS Yorktown, which had been astonishingly patched together in a frantic 48-hour repair marathon at Pearl Harbor after Coral Sea damage, finally succumbed. A Japanese submarine, I-168, managed to slip through the protective screen and delivered torpedoes that sealed the carrier's fate. This occurred just after Yorktown's critical contribution to the Battle of Midway, a battle in which 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed. Strategically, Midway was a turning point. Operationally, it still cost the United States one of the few fleet carriers it possessed. The third major setback came on September 15, 1942. Off Guadalcanal, the USS Wasp was hit by 3 torpedoes fired by the Japanese submarine I-19. Fires raged uncontrollably throughout the ship, fed by aviation fuel and munitions. After hours of desperate but futile attempts to save her, American destroyer Lansdowne was ordered to scuttle the burning vessel.
By this point, 3 of the 7 carriers that the U.S. Navy had available at the start of the Pacific War were gone, and the situation was about to worsen. From October 26 to 27, 1942, during the Battle of Santa Cruz, the USS Hornet, already renowned for launching the Doolittle raid and for her role at Midway, came under a relentless combination of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes. Although damage control teams fought with remarkable determination and tugs attempted to pull the crippled ship to safety, advancing Japanese surface forces made evacuation unavoidable. After the crew abandoned her, destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo delivered the final blows during the early morning. When word of these cumulative disasters reached Washington, Admiral Ernest King, serving as Chief of Naval Operations, presented Congress with a blunt assessment. Only one U.S. fleet carrier in the Pacific, the USS Enterprise, remained operational. Opposing her were 10 Japanese carriers. By simple numerical comparison, King warned, the United States appeared already defeated. But what King could not yet foresee was the scale of the industrial transformation about to unfold in American shipyards. He had no way of knowing that 1.7 million workers, including vast numbers of women like Margaret Thompson, would soon pour into the wartime shipbuilding industry. Nor could he predict the revolutionary methods developed by industrialist Henry Kaiser, who would slash Liberty ship construction times from over 230 days to a mere 4 days and a handful of hours. In 1941, U.S. shipyards had launched just a single fleet carrier, yet the seeds of change had already been planted, not in a military strategy session, but inside the administrative offices of Newport News Shipbuilding. On December 8, 1941, one day after the Pearl Harbor attack, Yard Supervisor Clay Bedford assembled his foremen and issued a radical directive: abandon traditional shipbuilding habits. We are going to build carriers the way Ford builds automobiles. The revolution began with an observation from Helen Matthews, a newly hired former seamstress. Watching crews carefully hammering rivets into massive hull plates, she innocently asked why the plates couldn't be joined like fabric, with a single continuous line rather than thousands of individual fasteners. Her supervisor initially chuckled, but then realized the idea pointed toward welding. Replacing rivets with welds could reduce construction time by as much as 75%. Welding also required far less specialized training, making it ideal for the rapidly expanding wartime labor force.
By mid-1943, the effects were unmistakable. Essex-class carriers, bigger, stronger, and more advanced than their pre-war predecessors, were rolling out of American shipyards at a pace that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The nation's wartime industrial surge had begun. and it was about to reshape the balance of power across the Pacific. When USS Essex was first begun on April 28, 1941, few imagined how quickly she would reach operational status. Yet on the final day of 1942, only 20 months after her keel touched the blocks, she formally joined the fleet, an astonishing pace for a warship of her size, and her rapid construction marked only the early phase of a production revolution. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a breakthrough emerged thanks to shipfitter first-class Giuseppe DiMaggio, relative of the well-known baseball figure, who supervised a team determined to rethink the way aircraft elevators were installed. Traditionally, crews assembled these platforms in cramped spaces aboard the ship, welding together dozens of components piece by piece. DiMaggio's group abandoned that routine completely. Entire elevator assemblies were fabricated on land, fully aligned and welded, then hoisted onto the hull by enormous yard cranes. The result was dramatic. Each carrier rolled out roughly 6 weeks sooner. Meanwhile, the sweeping industrial ideas championed by Henry Kaiser on the West Coast spread across American shipyards. Prefabrication transformed naval construction. Compartments, deck structures, and even complex housings were built in specialized shops where welders could rotate them sideways or upside down to maximize accuracy and speed. Tasks that previously absorbed 1,000 workers for an entire month could now be completed by 200 workers in a single week. It was a shift so profound that production figures began to escalate with a momentum that intimidated even the people recording them. The results were visible in hull numbers. USS Yorktown, CV-10, laid down one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, entered commission by April 1943. Intrepid, started the same day, joined the fleet just 16 months later. Hornet, CV-12, went from keel laying in August 1942 to active duty before the end of 1943. Franklin followed a similar pace, started in December 1942 and officially commissioned in January 1944. Every new hull seemed to appear faster than the last. A welder at Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard, Philip A. Kellogg, kept a diary that unintentionally documented the astonishing acceleration. In early 1943, he wrote that one carrier slid into the water roughly every 2 months. By summer, the interval had narrowed to 45 days. As the year closed, the pace quickened to one every 30 days. He joked, "The Japanese must think we've..."
But the magic was far from supernatural. It was human. By spring of 1943, nearly 40% of the workforce in Kaiser's production facilities consisted of women. Many had never entered industrial labor before the war. At Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Emma Rodriguez, a mother of 3 with no background in heavy tools, became the top riveter in the yard, driving 30 flawless rivets per minute. Executive Order 8802 opened skilled trades to African American workers, and thousands entered the yards. James Washington, once a sharecropper in Alabama, became a master pipe fitter at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, responsible for the fuel systems of 5 Essex-class carriers, each installed more efficiently than the last. Shipyard managers made the stakes explicit. Photo boards displayed battle-scarred images from the Pacific. USS Enterprise, fighting alone. Captions reminded workers that every delay meant more casualties on distant islands. "She needs sisters. Build them now," the placards insisted. Technological innovation accelerated construction even further. At New York Naval Yard, engineers refined modular shipbuilding to a level unprecedented at the time. Rather than assembling a carrier gradually from the bottom upward, workers produced enormous self-contained sections, already wired, plumbed, ventilated, and checked, then locked them together like oversized industrial tiles. This integration, combined with extensive standardization of components, allowed the fastest yards to complete carriers in just over a year. Standardization proved vital. Pumps, Electrical consoles, valves, and fittings were uniform across the entire class. A part manufactured in Detroit would fit seamlessly into a ship being assembled in Brooklyn, Newport News, or Philadelphia without alteration. The Essex class quickly emerged as one of the most influential families of warships ever produced by the United States. They were not merely replacements for lost pre-war carriers. They surpassed earlier designs in every respect, displacing roughly 27,100 tons, capable of sustaining over 33 knots, and able to embark 90 to 100 aircraft. They were formidable centers of naval power.
Japanese intelligence officers recognized this immediately. Commander Masatake Yokomiya of the Combined Fleet recorded with alarm that American yards were delivering new carriers faster than Japan could train replacement aviators. Each vessel, he noted, surpassed the capabilities of the carriers Japan had fielded at the war's outset. "We are not fighting the same Navy we struck at Pearl Harbor," he wrote. By March 1944, American shipbuilders had accomplished what many strategists once considered unattainable. The nation was launching Essex-class carriers at a pace that outstripped the total carrier production of every other country combined. What observers later called the Kaiser miracle was, in truth, the culmination of industrial ingenuity, social transformation, and relentless urgency, a mobilization effort unmatched in naval history. While the major naval shipyards focused their efforts on turning out the large fleet carriers, a very different revolution in shipbuilding was unfolding on the American West Coast. Industrialist Henry Kaiser, already famous for speeding up Liberty ship production, applied the same aggressive innovation to a new category of vessel, the escort carrier. These smaller jeep carriers became essential for shielding amphibious forces and patrolling the oceans for submarines. Kaiser's facility in Vancouver, Washington, became the center of this transformation. Using mass production techniques adapted directly from his merchant ship programs, the yard produced 50 escort carriers, a record that redefined naval construction. The lead ship of this enormous output, the USS Casablanca, representing the most numerous carrier class ever built, traveled from the moment its keel touched the blocks to formal commissioning in under 8 months, an astonishing pace. To appreciate that speed, one need only look at the Japanese experience. Their escort carrier, Shinyo, converted from a civilian passenger liner, required 2 full years before it was ready for service. The supply chain machine. Behind every hull plate and aircraft elevator stood an immense continent-wide industrial web. The raw materials that fed the American carrier program moved in an almost musical rhythm, a supply chain symphony in every sense. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, operating with relentless round-the-clock schedules, rolled out the heavy plates used for flight decks. At the same time, Alcoa's Tennessee plants provided the aluminum for naval aircraft, drawing so much electrical power that their consumption rivaled that of entire municipalities. Far from the coasts in Akron, Ohio, the Goodyear factory manufactured the thick, high-tension arresting cables that brought landing aircraft to a halt. Each cable could absorb the force of a 12,000-pound fighter hitting the deck at nearly 100 miles per hour. Under plant manager William Davis, production jumped dramatically from just 10 cables a month in 1942 to around 200 per month by 1944. Building the human component. Ships alone could not fight a war. Trained crews were just as vital. The U.S. Navy's answer emerged from the imagination of Captain Daniel Gallery, who suggested turning the Great Lakes into a massive training arena. 2 side-paddle steamers, USS Wolverine and USS Sable, were converted into makeshift carriers and stationed at Chicago's Navy Pier. By 1944, these unusual vessels were turning out roughly 500 qualified pilots every month, providing the Navy with a steady stream of aviators prepared to operate from real combat carriers. From the Japanese viewpoint. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy followed American industrial reports with increasing unease. Captain Toshikazu Omi, serving as an operations officer for the combined fleet, later reflected that Japanese planners expected the United States to replace its wartime losses, perhaps constructing half a dozen fleet carriers by 1945. The actual figures, he later admitted, were beyond anything we had imagined. This grim reality confronted Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. His carrier force, reduced to 6 operational vessels, found itself facing an American armada consisting of 9 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. Ozawa would later write that the engagement was not a contest at all. It was a systematic destruction. The peak of production. By the beginning of 1945, American naval shipbuilding reached a cadence that seemed almost unreal. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, 3 carriers were under construction at the same time. Meanwhile, Newport News Shipbuilding had carriers in progress across 6 separate slipways, illustrating the industrial momentum that made the U.S. carrier fleet effectively inexhaustible. The aircraft carrier USS Lake Champlain set an astonishing benchmark for wartime shipbuilding. Launched into service on June 3, 1945, the vessel emerged from the docks barely 15 months after workers first laid its keel, an almost unbelievable pace that stood unmatched among ships completed during the war years. Yet such velocity in production came with a human price that lingered long after the champagne bottles shattered across new bows. Across American shipyards, accidents claimed the lives of more than 3,000 laborers during the conflict. One of countless wartime tragedies struck Margaret O'Brien, who lost her husband in a catastrophic cable failure at the Four River shipyard. Instead of retreating into grief, she returned to the yard the following week, stepping directly into his place on a welding team. To her coworkers who questioned her resolve, she offered a stark reminder: every ship unfinished is another gold star in someone's window. Her words captured the somber determination that powered the wartime industrial machine. When Japan's surrender party boarded the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, they were confronted with a sight nearly beyond comprehension. Stretching across Tokyo Bay and the adjacent waters was a force of American carriers. Over 100 of them, representing an industrial feat no nation had ever approached. The United States had launched more carriers in just a few years than the rest of the world combined had produced since naval aviation began. One Japanese officer, Commander Tamichi Hira, among the most honored destroyer captains in the Imperial Navy, later reflected with disbelief. We sank 4 of their carriers in 1942, and by the time the war closed, they had replaced each one several times over. His words underscored the scale of American wartime manufacturing, which increasingly felt less like production and more like momentum of an unstoppable force. The roster of Essex-class fleet carriers that entered combat during the war illustrates that momentum in stark detail. USS Essex, CV-9, commissioned December 31, 1942. USS Yorktown, CV-10, April 15, 1943. USS Intrepid, CV-11, August 16, 1943. USS Hornet, CV-12, November 29, 1943. USS Franklin, CV-13, January 31, 1944. USS Ticonderoga, CV-14, May 8, 1944. USS Randolph, CV-15, October 9, 1944. USS Lexington, CV-16, February 17, 1943. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, May 24, 1943. USS Wasp, CV-18, November 24, 1943. USS Hancock, CV-19, April 15, 1944. USS Bennington, CV-20, August 6, 1944. USS Bonham Richard, CV-31, November 26,
1944. USS Shangri-La, CV-38, September 15, 1944. Several additional Essex-class carriers reached completion before the war ended but did not enter combat. USS Boxer, April 16, 1945. USS Lake Champlain, June 3, 1945. USS Antietam, January 28, 1945. Many more followed in the immediate post-war period, and even this impressive list omits the 9 Independence-class light carriers built atop cruiser hulls, as well as the 100-plus escort carriers mass-produced to support worldwide operations. The innovations that enabled this massive output reshaped American industry far beyond the war. Techniques such as modular construction, extensive automated welding, and assembly line shipbuilding became permanent fixtures of post-war manufacturing. The workforce that learned these skills, women newly trained in precision trades, African American workers finally granted technical roles, veterans of the industrial front, helped power the economic expansion that followed. By the final year of the war, the United States was producing carriers at a rate that no longer matched operational demand. Crews could not be trained fast enough to fill the berths of newly completed ships. As Admiral William Halsey explained before Congress in 1946, "We began the war with too few carriers and ended it with more than we could effectively deploy. History offers no parallel to the pace at which these combat ships were built."
It was a record forged not only of steel and machinery, but of remarkable human endurance and of a nation's determination to overwhelm its enemies with industrial might on a scale the world had never witnessed. The legacy of the American workforce. In 1985, 4 decades after the end of the Pacific War, Newport News Shipbuilding opened its gates for a massive homecoming event. More than 5,000 men and women who had once labored there during World War II gathered to remember the years when the shipyard had been at the center of the nation's war effort. Among them was Margaret Thompson, the welder featured at the beginning of our story, now a grandmother in her late 60s. When she stepped up to address the crowd, she reflected on how history had recast her generation. "People label us the greatest generation today," she said. "But greatness wasn't what drove us back then. We were furious. Our ships had been sent to the bottom, our brothers and fathers never came home. So we responded in the only way we could, by turning steel into a weapon. Every weld we laid down was our way of saying that Pearl Harbor would not be forgotten." A social and economic upheaval. The wartime carrier construction program reshaped far more than the U.S. Navy. It reconfigured American communities, finances, and social norms. A place like Richmond, California illustrates the scale of the transformation. The city ballooned from a quiet town of roughly 23,000 residents to a booming industrial hub of 130,000 in just 3 years. The wages earned in the shipyards, over $3 billion, circulated throughout the national economy and helped lay the foundation for what would become the post-war middle class. Inside these facilities, old boundaries cracked. Women proved that physically demanding industrial labor was not an exclusively male domain, and African American workers demonstrated, when finally allowed into skilled positions, that capability had never been the issue, only opportunity. A fleet built by sheer numerical power. By the final summer of the war, the United States possessed a naval aviation force whose size defied comparison. 14 Essex-class fleet carriers had already fought in combat. 3 additional Essexes had entered service but too late to see action. 9 light carriers of the Independence class operated alongside them, as did 71 escort carriers plus several pre-war carriers still sailing.
When set against Japan's remaining 6 operational carriers, many of which lacked experienced air crews, and Britain's 19 carriers of all types, the scale of American production becomes unmistakable. It was an industrial phenomenon as much as a military one.
A final acknowledgement. Years later, in 1962, Rear Admiral Hideo Yano of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force toured the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, the birthplace of numerous Essex-class carriers. Standing on the site where USS Yorktown had once slid into the water, he paused and spoke through an interpreter. "We understood during the war that the United States was building ships, but we never grasped the magnitude. In one yard, you produced what our entire empire struggled to match. We were not defeated by your fleets alone. We were defeated by your factories, by your laborers, and by the resolve that allowed you to manufacture at a pace beyond anything we believed possible." In the years after the Second World War, Admiral Chester Nimitz distilled the Pacific conflict into a single decisive conclusion. The fate of the war had been sealed, not on a battlefield, but in the shipyards of 1943. According to him, victory emerged from a simple numerical truth. Once the United States reached the point where the loss of a carrier class could be absorbed because 2 more were already sliding down the launch rails, Japan's defeat became unavoidable. The industrial balance, not the clash of fleets, determined the endgame. The astonishing manufacturing momentum that surged between 1942 and 1945 still echoes through modern naval construction. Many of the production methods refined during those urgent wartime years remain foundational today. Yet the most profound inheritance from that era is not technological. It is the proof of what democratic nations can accomplish when their citizens rally behind a shared purpose. In just 3 years, the United States moved from suffering the catastrophic loss of 4 major carriers and confronting the real possibility of strategic collapse to establishing a carrier force so dominant that the war's outcome shifted from uncertain to inevitable. The men and women who drove that transformation demonstrated that the true power of a democracy lies not simply in weaponry, but in its capacity to mobilize and produce on an unprecedented scale. Their factories, welding lines, dry docks, and assembly platforms became a different kind of battlefield, one where productivity determined survival. The leap from losing 4 frontline carriers to deploying 14 Essex-class carriers in active service remains unmatched as an industrial response to military crisis. Most of the workers responsible for this surge have passed on, but the magnitude of their accomplishment endures. At a moment when totalitarian regimes sought to extinguish free societies, American laborers, many of whom had never touched a ship before the war, generated a tidal wave of industrial output unlike anything in human experience. Their effort ensured that when the world entered its darkest hour, democracy answered not with despair, but with overwhelming production. The carriers lost in 1942, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet, were not merely replaced, they were surpassed. Every new vessel that left the slipways was more capable, more resilient, and more formidable than the ship it replaced. Each hull represented the ability of a free people to convert catastrophe into renewed strength. In the final analysis, Japan was not overcome by superior American tactics alone. It was overpowered by workers like Margaret Thompson, whose welding torch stitched together the steel that would project American power across the Pacific. It was defeated by the millions whose collective effort revealed democracy's ultimate advantage, an almost limitless potential for production when its citizens act in unison. The numbers themselves form a narrative of transformation, from 4 lost carriers to 14 Essex-class giants operating in combat. That numerical shift stands as one of history's most compelling illustrations of what a society can achieve when its liberty is confronted with annihilation.
Those shipbuilders did more than assemble fleets. They forged the conditions for victory, safeguarded the idea of freedom, and helped shape the post-war world. Their legacy is captured in the sentiment engraved at Newport News Shipbuilding, that in the face of oppression, American workers answered with steel. Against fascism, they offered freedom, and in the place of despair, they produced the most extraordinary manufacturing feat the world has ever seen.